So turning now to Jimmy. Jimmy's Deli, it's a restaurant, takeout sandwich store in Tucson, Arizona. For the purposes of this presentation, the location is not that important as long as it's somewhere in the United States, although it may have some effect with regard to unemployment benefits, which we'll talk about a little bit. It's owned by Jimmy Brown. Jimmy was operating with 48 employees, managers, assistant managers, cooks, waiters, and busboys. Back on March 25th, the mayor of Tucson signed an ordinance directing restaurants to close their dining rooms to customers, but takeout services could continue. Because that was going to, effectively decimate his business, Jimmy felt obligated at that point to immediately furlough 38 of his hourly employees. He provides health benefits to most of his employees, and he uses G&A as his PEO, so his employees are paid by G&A, and G&A takes care of his health and other benefits. So scenario one, this is the most optimistic scenario. Jimmy has heard about, this recent federal action. He thinks his staff is one of his business's greatest assets. A major consideration here is obviously if you cut ties with all of your employees when the pandemic is over, you're going to have to rehire and retrain totally new staff, which is going to be a major hassle for employers. So Jimmy's going to try and ride it out. He's going to try and use the relief programs. He's going to bring back his 38 employees from furlough and pay them salaries, even though some of them literally have nothing to do since the dining room has been closed. So first we'll talk about the expanded FMLA leave and the paid sick leave. So clearly Jimmy's is going to be subject to those new requirements because they have fewer than 500 employees. But because Jimmy's has less than 50 employees, they could claim that exemption that Seth was talking about when he was reviewing those rules earlier for any particular employee that tried to make a claim here. And the rest of the slide sort of runs through the factors that could provide a basis for Jimmy to, take the position that he doesn't have to provide expanded FMLA or paid sick leave to any particular employee. The first bullet there is that providing it would cause sort of a financial burden exceeding his available business revenues and cause it to cease operating at a minimal capacity. Second is the absence would be a substantial risk to his financial health or operational capabilities because the employee has specialized skills or knowledge. And then thirdly, if you didn't have sufficient workers to actually cover the employee who was going to go out on the leave and you needed that person in order to operate at a minimal capacity. So Jimmy's going to try and comply with the law, and two issues pop up immediately. Issue number one is Christina, who is one of his assistant managers who's no longer actually coming to the restaurant, calls Jimmy and says she wants to apply for the expanded FMLA because she's got to care for her 8-year-old daughter whose school has been shut down. Meanwhile, Larry, who's one of the cooks, tells Jimmy that he wants to apply for the paid sick leave because his 16-year-old son went to a party last weekend. One of the kids at the party turns out to have now been diagnosed with COVID-19. He called his son's doctor. The doctor said that Larry's son should self-quarantine for 2 weeks, and Larry needs to stay home to take care of his 16-year-old. So what are the results here? The first result, Christina is probably not going to be eligible for the expanded FMLA, at least as we are reading the guidance. And if you read the DOL FAQs and the regulations that came out yesterday, DOL's position seems to be that if an employee doesn't actually have any work to perform, then she cannot use expanded FMLA or the new paid sick leave for hours that she is no longer scheduled to work. And essentially, they take the position that just the mere fact that the work is no longer available because of the national pandemic is not really a COVID-19 qualifying reason. It's got to be some way in which COVID-19 touches that employee personally or someone close to them, if you can sort of draw that distinction. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but that seems to be where DOL is. Now, the reason why that's important is that Jimmy's got to be able to make that determination, because if he reads the law incorrectly and allows Christina to take the expanded FMLA leave under the new law, he's probably not going to qualify for the federal tax credit. So in this particular circumstance, now, if you look at it from Christina's standpoint, she kind of doesn't care because she's getting paid by Jimmy anyways. So, she might have said, well, I want the expanded FMLA, but she's going to be sitting at home getting a paycheck with no work to do. But if Jimmy, tries to get cute about this and say, well, she didn't have anything to do anyways, I'm just going to recharacterize her comp as being paid under the expanded FMLA leave and try and claim that tax credit, he may run into a problem with the IRS if they find out, the real circumstances that we're applying here. Larry, on the other hand, appears to be pretty clearly eligible for paid sick leave under the law. Caring for someone who's been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine is a valid basis for obtaining paid sick leave. One thing that Jimmy should keep in mind is that he should ask Larry to provide documentation of that healthcare provider's advice, a letter or a note, because assuming he's going to try and claim the tax credit related to that paid sick leave at some point in the future, he needs to be able to substantiate it in the event the IRS comes calling at some point down the line. So, in terms of the tax credits, Jimmy can go ahead and claim a refundable tax credit equal to 100% of the qualified sick leave wages that Jimmy pays to Larry. And again, as Seth mentioned, the rate at which the paid sick leave is paid out, it depends on a number of different factors, one of which being the basis for which the leave is being taken. Essentially, if you're taking the paid sick leave because you yourself are sick, you generally can get a higher rate of pay than if you're taking the paid sick leave because you're caring for somebody else. So in Larry's situation, the paid sick leave is going to be based on 2/3 of his regular rate of pay as opposed to 100% of his pay. It's also, because it's needed to care for a child, it's capped. Paid sick leave is capped at $200 a day, whereas other types of leave are capped at $511 a day. The tax credit is always going to be capped at the same amount that the paid leave is paid out at. So in this scenario, Larry can get up to $200 a day of paid sick leave, depending on what his regular rate of pay is. If it is $200 a day, then the maximum tax credit that Jimmy's can take is also capped at $200 a day. Now, let's say, Jimmy, out of the goodness of his heart, he feels bad for Larry. Larry was actually, making more than $200 a day, probably unlikely as a cook, but, we'll just say. So he decides to provide Larry with additional paid sick leave. Obviously, Jimmy's can do that. They can provide as much paid sick leave as they want, but keep in mind, they're not going to get a tax credit for that excess amount. So the tax credit is always going to be limited by what you are actually required to pay under the law. Next up is we turn to the Paycheck protection loan. Is this a good option for Jimmy's? Well, Jimmy's is almost certainly going to qualify for a Paycheck protection loan. Again, he's only got 47 employees. We talked a little bit about those affiliation rules where, if there was some sort of related company or he was owned by an investment company, you might have to think about that. But in our scenario, we'll keep it simple and assume he's just got 47 people. There's nothing stopping him from getting a Paycheck protection loan, probably.
Actually, Malcolm, let me jump in there with one comment just to highlight for folks. We talked a lot about the affiliation rules for hospitality and food industries establishments. So for like fast food, hotels, motels, the affiliation rules that would otherwise apply to count whether you cross that, say, 500 employee threshold, that applies on, first of all, those affiliation rules would not apply to establishments that are in industries or sectors that begin with an NAICS code 72. Additionally, for purposes of counting the 500, you're going to look at each separate facility. So Jimmy's actually in a really good spot because even if Jimmy was larger because he's in the food industry, he might be able to end up in a better place than, say, if it was Jimmy's hardware. Because again, if your hospitality or food and your NAICS code begins with a 72, there are more generous rules to allow you to access the small business loan.
Yep, that is a terrific point, Seth. Thank you. Another thing we wanted to point out is, the fact that Jimmy's employees are being paid through GNA would have no impact on its ability to get a loan based on current SBA guidance. Because this program is so new, SBA is working out a lot of the details in terms of how employers that have relationships with PEOs are going to go about applying for the loans. But we are 100% confident that employers with relationships with PEOs will have access to these loans. It's just kind of working out the details of exactly how that is going to work in terms of getting the information to the SBA. The terms of these paycheck protection loans are incredibly favorable. Interest rate, according to SBA, is going to be 0.5%. Payments are automatically deferred for 6 months. And as Seth talked about earlier, maximum loan amount is going to be based on Jimmy's total monthly payments for payroll costs during the 1-year period before the date the loan is made. Once he gets the loan, he can use it for payroll costs, which includes paying for benefits. He could use it to pay off interest on his mortgages for his business, the rent on his leases, and also utility payments. And again, Seth touched on this. The goal here is to try and get employers to retain their workforce. So if Jimmy's uses the loan amount only for the items that are listed in that slide for the 8 weeks after getting the loan, and he's able to maintain his workforce and he doesn't cut salaries, Jimmy's has an excellent chance of having that entire loan forgiven, would effectively convert into a grant, and that grant is non-taxable under the CARES Act. So it really, the benefits here are potentially, really fantastic. You may say, well, hold on one second. Jimmy did furlough his employees for a couple of weeks there. Is that going to be a problem for him when he asks for forgiveness? The fact that they weren't employed for the entire period. The good news is the law has a sort of a, get out of jail free card or, fix the problem card. As long as you bring your employees back, or if you cut their salaries, you restore their salaries to what they were previously, you can effectively sort of cure it under the terms of the law. You just have to take those actions to either fix your workforce or fix your salaries by no later than June 30th of this year. So if Jimmy's ends up taking one of these paycheck protection loans, one thing to keep in mind, and this is a concept we'll repeat during the presentation, all of these programs are great, but the IRS or the federal government doesn't want you double dipping. So generally, if you're getting a credit under one of these programs, it's difficult to get a credit under another one. There are limitations that apply. So for example, we talked about the maximum loan amount being based on Jimmy's payroll costs. Well, keep in mind that any paid sick leave wages that Jimmy is paying to Larry will not be taken into account for purpose of those payroll costs because Jimmy's already getting the tax credit on those wages. Jimmy's also can't utilize the deferral of payment of Social Security taxes program if the paycheck protection loan is forgiven. And we'll talk about that program next. And if Jimmy's gets a paycheck protection loan, regardless of whether or not he gets it forgiven or not, he cannot also utilize the employee retention tax credit program. And again, we'll talk about that in a little more detail as well. So if Jimmy decides to write it out, he absolutely can use the deferral program, the deferral of the payment of the Social Security taxes. He can start doing that immediately through the end of this year. Again, it'd defer 50% to the end of 2021, 50% to the end of 2022. Again, the fact that there's a PEO involved here shouldn't be a problem for being able to use this program. Probably the only catch here is that if he decides to use the deferral program, the deferral of the payment of the Social Security taxes, and he also gets a paycheck protection loan, he cannot seek forgiveness of that paycheck protection loan in the way that the law is currently written. And then lastly, the employee retention tax credit. So one of the requirements of this particular benefit is that you have to either have had your business shut down due to government orders, or you have to have had a decline of at least 50% in your gross receipts in a calendar quarter as compared to the same calendar quarter from the prior year. Jimmy's, has basically had their dining room shut down by the mayor, so he should absolutely qualify for this tax credit. And he's got less than 100 full-time employees, so he should be able to take essentially the maximum credit, 50% of the wages paid, capped at $10,000 per quarter per employee. So that works out to a maximum credit of $5,000 per employee. Those qualified wages, as Seth mentioned, would include the employer cost of maintaining his health care. But again, think and no double dipping. So any wages paid to Larry would not be subject to the credit. Again, the relationship with G&A won't affect his ability to get the credit. But then again, no double dipping. This particular employee retention tax credit isn't available if Jimmy obtains a Paycheck protection loan. Now, Seth put together this graphic, which I thought was great, which we're using here. Seth, do you want to just quickly go through this?
Absolutely. So what this is effectively showing is just that when you choose one of the various building blocks, it may affect the ability to utilize others. So here, if you take a PPP loan, right, the Paycheck Protection Program loan, where really you're probably hoping it becomes the grant, the PPP grant, because you get the amounts forgiven. If you do that, regardless of whether you seek forgiveness, you cannot use the 50% employee retention tax credit. So it has a big red X through it. You'll see the little X on the employment tax deferral provision. What that means is you can take a PPP loan and defer the employer's share of employment taxes otherwise owed through the end of this year and pay them over your multi-year period. But that little red X is there to remind you that you can't seek forgiveness on the PPP loan. So if you're going to seek forgiveness on the PPP loan, you're effectively walking away from both the employment tax deferral and the employee retention tax credit. So just be mindful there. And so then just to play that out, say you take the 50% employee retention tax credit. Well, then you definitely aren't using the PPP loan, but you could use the employment tax deferral. So you could basically get a deferral of the employer's share of employment taxes owed through 2020, payable in 2021 and 2022, plus the 50% employee retention tax credit. Similarly, if you were to take the employment tax deferral, you could use both the 50% employee retention tax credit and a PPP loan, but not if you seek any amounts to be forgiven. So just keeping those pieces in mind is important.
Great, thanks, Seth. So a couple of other considerations here, not necessarily directly related to the new legal requirements, but things employers have to be thinking about. Obviously, in the situation where Jimmy keeps all his employees on, they won't be eligible for unemployment benefits. We'll talk about unemployment benefits a little bit more as we get into the other scenarios, but this is obviously something that employers have to think about. You saw the unemployment numbers this morning, which are, absolutely horrifying. The federal government has taken action to, try and shore up unemployment programs, and I'm sure you've heard about the additional $600 supplemental payments that are now going to be available. But there are a lot of employers out there who are now have to think about, well, are my employees actually better going on unemployment than they are, staying with me, particularly if I'm not going to be able to pay them. Second issue here, this one is not applicable to Jimmy directly because he's only got 47 employees, but we want to make sure, the employers out there who have more than 50 full-time employees are thinking about it. Keep in mind the ACA employer mandate rules are still in effect. Entirely possible we will see some sort of relief from those rules later this year. It's definitely been talked about, but currently, the ACA rules still apply. So if you've got more than 50 full-time employees, you've got to offer them some level of health coverage, or you're potentially exposing yourself to potential penalties from the IRS. So as long as those rules remain in effect, employers with more than 50 full-time employees need to be thinking about, how is it that I'm going to be able to maintain health coverage in these, very difficult times.